Okay. Hey, I'm out of my element. I'm talking about micro now, not macro. Okay. Well, I used to teach micro, and I still remember some of it, and I've always had an interest in minimum wage legislation. So let's have a go at it. 6 telling questions. We'll see how this works out. But what I want to show you first is just some statistics so you can get an idea of where we are with minimum wage relative to poverty level. The 2010 poverty levels are on the screen now. They're identical to the 2009 poverty levels, which means we haven't had that much price inflation in that year's time. And so you can see for households of 1, 2, 3, 4, and what they are. Now, the arguments for raising minimum wage, and I'm looking back in during the 2000 campaign because that's when it was hotly debated the last time, that eventually led to legislation that increased the minimum wage. There were a couple of kind of arguments, both mathematical, one more sophisticated than the other. But let me show you both of them so you can see where we started, at least with the popular press and the political arguments. The first one focused on the minimum wage of $5.15 for starters, which was the minimum wage for 10 years, 97 to 2007. And if you do some calculations, $5.15 an hour, you know how to do this, multiply by 40 hours a week, and then multiply that by 52 weeks per year, and you get the annual salary, okay, $10,712. Okay, that's just short of the poverty line, however that was set, for one individual. Now, if we change the minimum wage to $7.25, we can run the math again, the same numbers, 40, 52, $15,080, and so that would put even two households just above, just above the poverty line, all right? Little math there, and hey, that's the sophisticated one, okay? So the unsophisticated one was articulated by lots of people, including one of my favorite, Lou Dobbs, okay? It's mathematical too, and it goes like this. 2007 minus 1997 is 10 years. And so we'll go right to the chase there. Isn't it about time to raise the minimum wage? How can you argue with that? But especially significant because that's the way he put the question to when he was master of ceremonies in one of the debates among the candidates. That was the question. That was the math that he presented. That was the question he asked for them to ask. Of course, the political rhetoric, let's see where we go from here. I'll get you attuned to the issues. What are the issues with minimum wage for us, for economists? The distinction between intentions and consequences, between rhetoric and reality, between caring and thinking. I tell my Auburn students, you can have care coming out both ears, but unless you're willing to think, you might do people more harm than good. The difference between politics and economics, and we got those things all partitioned out just right. In other words, if you don't know any economics, then you're likely to think in terms of intentions, rhetoric, caring, and politics. If you do know economics, you think in terms of consequences, reality, and so on. All right? Well, let's look at some of the political You recognize him? That's the trimmer, slimmer Gore back in 2000. This was from his acceptance speech. We will honor hard work by raising the minimum wage. I'm not sure how much honor there is in the minimum wage, but that was a substitute for argument. Carry, if we can have trillions of dollars of tax cuts for the wealthiest people, we can fight for a raise in the minimum wage. Okay, so he's just looking at rich and poor, and let's make the poor rich by raising the minimum wage. She says it's past time to stand up for working families and raise the minimum wage. I'm not quite sure what that means. We could have done it earlier, but hey, it's past time now, But I think she means let's go ahead and do it. We should have done it before. Oh, we love him. Let me go back. What did he say? Raising the minimum wage is one of the most important steps we could take to lift working families out of poverty and into the middle class. Middle class making the minimum wage? I don't think so. Okay. That's what he said, you know. Anybody else? Oh, my God. Now, this is sort of, I put this in my show a long time ago, but what she said lately makes this all the more special. Increasing the minimum wage to $7.25 per hour brings a pay raise for up to 13 million Americans. And with the new minimum wage, we're also stimulating the economy by giving hardworking Americans the income they need to buy groceries, fill their gas tanks, and get their children ready to head back to school. So this stimulates the economy to raise the minimum wage. Now, of course, she's extending the unemployment benefits, saying that that stimulates the economy too. Okay, so it doesn't matter whether you pay people to work, pay them not to work, or interfere with their wages or whatever. It stimulates the economy. Linda Chavez. Anybody remember her who's old enough in here to remember Linda Chavez? Bush 41's first choice for labor secretary. And it was widely reported in the news outlets that Linda Chavez does not believe in the minimum wage. She doesn't believe in it. Okay? Does that look like an uncaring person to you? You know, how motherly. You can't imagine a more caring person. But she doesn't believe in the minimum wage. Well, what gives? Mankiw, we have trouble with in macro, but here he's kind of diplomatic. We believe that a legislated minimum wage is a poorly targeted anti-poverty device. In fact, it redistributes income in the opposite direction. And he said this while he was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under Bush. Okay, well, let's look at the specifics. There's the minimum wage. And it started in 1938 under guess who? Roosevelt, at 25 cents an hour. And it's been raised from time to time up to $5.15. This chart came from that debate that happened back in 2000, so that's why I happened to have it going to 2000. But there's the consumer price index, so prices has increased too, and we know why that is. A lot of money creation during the period. And so what we see with the minimum wage is, this is the real minimum wage, okay, adjusted for prices. And so what we see is that the minimum wage rate rises with acts of Congress, and then it falls as inflation erodes its purchasing power. So that's a never-ending sequence of events. Rises with passages of legislation, falls as we get more and more inflation. You can see it hit its high water mark, 1968, the equivalent of $8 measured in year 2000 dollars, equivalent of $10 today. If we were to match the real wage of 68 as a minimum, it would be a minimum wage of $10 an hour. It crosses there at 2000 because we're using 2000 as our base for the prices. Minimum wage applies mainly to the market for unskilled labor, just because that's the labor that would have a market price possibly lower than the minimum. And we can easily draw some supply-demand curves here. I can go quickly through this because you know about supply and demand. There's a supply of that unskilled labor slopes upward, and a demand that slopes downward. The market equilibrium is brought about by adjustment in market wages. There it is. Okay. And the total income earned by unskilled labor can be represented by that rectangle, the wage rate paid times the number of worker hours bought and sold in the marketplace. I'm showing my macro stripes by letting Y represent income. Is simply the wage times the number of worker hours hired. So suppose that labor's market clearing wage is $5. So we'll label that $5. And then we put a legislated minimum of $7.25. I'll put that as a tick mark on the horizontal axis. because we have to ask ourselves a couple of questions here, thinking like economists, and realize that minimum wage does not stipulate that anyone who wants to work for the minimum is guaranteed a job at that wage. No, it doesn't do that. It simply outlaws the employment of agreements that entail wage rates less than the minimum. It precludes some employment opportunities. So, how many workers would firms want to hire at the price of $7.25? Well, that's what the demand curve shows you. Okay, and how many workers would willingly supply their labor? Well, more than that. I mean, that's the whole essence of a price floor, that you get more people wanting to supply the commodity, whatever it is, than are demanding it. How many worker hours are both supplied and demanded? Well, that's governed by the short side of the market, as indicated by Marshall. Alfred Marshall's dictum, trade is governed by the short side of the market. You have to have a supplier and a demander. And of course, the difference between quantity supplied and quantity demand, generically we call it a surplus. There it is. For the labor market, call it unemployment. All right? So that's the unemployment caused by the minimum wage. So establishing this price floor in the market for labor eliminates many entry-level jobs. In the words of Sowell, Thomas Sowell, author of Race and Economics, minimum wage cuts off the bottom rung of the economic ladder, that people have trouble breaking into the labor market because they can't get that first job. They're part of the unemployed. In fact, what's instructive here, and goes to Mankiw's point, is that it tends to hurt the very people it's intended to help. And we see that by looking at who is employed here and who is not employed. Let's start with the people that are on that part of the graph. In other words, there was some demand for labor, and those are the people that got the jobs. Who are these people? Well, they tend to be secondary and part-time workers in multi-income households. Maybe the primary worker is making well above the minimum wage. But the secondary worker, who maybe just wants to work part-time, or maybe hasn't acquired the skills that the primary worker had, takes a job at $7.25. It would include entry-level worker with a clear potential for advancement. And it would include young workers from working-class households. A lot of working-class households are already making well above the minimum. They have good work habits, and they teach their children those habits, and they're the ones that get employed when you have a minimum wage. If you look at who's not employed, it turns out to be would-be workers from the lowest income families and victims of gender, race, and age discrimination are the first to go. Single parents with young children, too many absences, okay, soon not hire those people. So the very people who are most in need of a job at $7.25 are the very ones who get excluded. So minimum wage is an inverse Robin Hood. It redistributes income from the lowest income families to the higher income families. Not very high, but higher than the ones it throws out of work. For those most in need of getting a foothold on the marketplace, the minimum wage cuts off a few rungs of the labor market ladder. I searched the web for a labor market ladder, and there it is. Okay? So the idea is that for the entry level, you can get a job at a fairly low wage rate, but a little on-the-job training will make you semi-skilled, and you're making above the minimum wage. All right? If we have a minimum wage, we lose a couple of rungs. Okay, there they go. And you can't get a foothold on the ladder, and so as a result, you lose the worker. And that one and many others show up instead in the unemployment line. All right? That's the way the minimum wage works. This appeared, I think it was in New York Times, makes the same point. And I don't know if it's funny to economists or even funny to non-economists. Non-economists wouldn't get it, okay? and economists already know it. As a display of our compassion, we've raised the minimum wage, right? Not too accessible. And here I put this in here because you can see the intentions to show compassion and the actual consequences to make it pretty hard to enter the labor market. Typical voter supports minimum wage. Why would that be? Voter is or wants to be a compassionate person, wants to be seen as a compassionate person. The voter has no inkling of the legislation's actual consequences. That's very typical. And the voter believes or imagines that himself to benefit directly or indirectly from the legal minimum. He may not, but some people think they're in that position. Typical politician supports minimum wage. Can you guess? They want to appear to be compassionate. I mean, it's a vote loser if you get out and say you're against the minimum wage. Again, this is more common than makes you comfortable. Have no inkling at all about the legislation's actual consequences. Pelosi and a bunch of others. Or that he or she has many politically active constituents who actually will benefit, and not necessarily poor people making low income, as we'll see. And lastly, he or she knows what the typical voter believes, imagines, or doesn't know. Okay, so you vote on the basis of what your constituents think, and not what you think or what you know. Okay, and here just showing you this wage went up in 70-cent increments over a period of several years, each time generating more unemployment. And just for comparison purposes, I put the all-time high, which in today's dollars would be $10, a very high minimum wage, even relative to our $7.25. Okay. I didn't warn you about this, but I have test questions along the way, just to keep you awake. If raising the minimum wage to $7.25 is a good thing, why wouldn't raising it to $10 be better? That's not one of my test questions. And why wouldn't $20 or $50 be better still? And of course the answer here is that the consequences are independent of past levels of minimum wage. Any current minimum above the market wage will be accompanied by unemployment. The higher the minimum, the greater the unemployment. That's why. I might point out here that unemployment associated with the minimum wage is either not picked up or only faintly picked up by the published unemployment statistics. All right? And the reason for that is, I'll give you two reasons now. And one is that to be categorized as unemployed, you have to be looking for a job. And if you're frozen out of the market because of the minimum wage, you won't look for a job very long. You'll understand that they've been eliminated. In other words, these people may be unskilled, but they're not stupid. They don't keep looking for a job that's not there. But as soon as they're not looking, then they're not unemployed. They're just outside the labor force. Also, some people do find a job, but it's a worse job in an area that's not controlled. Maybe it's babysitting, or maybe it's the growing arts and crafts fair where you make arts and crafts and sell them at malls when they have fairs and so on. And you end up making well below the minimum wage. But that's the best you can do given the minimum. So it causes some people to be underemployed. It causes others to be outside the labor force, neither of which is included in the unemployment statistics. There's Mises, if wages, either by union pressure or in compulsion or by government decree, that's minimum wage, are raised above the market rate, lasting unemployment of a part of the potential labor force develops. Pretty clear about these issues. And here I'll just bring you up to date on what's happened to prices And you can see that in 2009, we actually had a decrease in the price level, which made it pretty troublesome when you increase the minimum wage at that point. There's the stair-step increase in the minimum wage. And what we note here is in that last 70% increase, where prices went down by 2.2%, it amounted to a 13% raise for people who were able to keep their jobs at the minimum wage. But it also means a lot of people lost their jobs because firms couldn't afford to pay a 13% wage. So here's an instance where typically inflation will erode the value and cause the minimum wage to be less troublesome. Here it got amplified when that price level went down. And you can always also see that that last increase in the minimum wage came when the economy was suffering from the recession. And that's the worst time, of course, to have wages increase. I think I put a slide in here for that. There's the civilian unemployment rate, and you can see that it's peaked above 10%, just missing the earlier peak of about 10.8% during the early 80s. If you look at it, that's the last 5 years, and you can look at right after we came out of recession, so-called, which was the end of 2009. That was the official declared end of the recession. The recovery isn't much better, as you can see, but you can see there's an uptick in unemployment. So when the minimum wage is raised, you do get some temporary unemployment as those people are looking for other jobs outside the bounds of that minimum wage legislation. And I suspect that part of that rise is attributable to that. More significantly, I think, is the labor force participation rate. These are all the people who are either employed or are looking, as opposed to simply not being in the labor force at all. And that participation rate has declined substantially in recent times, which again underscores that the official unemployment rate doesn't tell the whole story. Lots of people have just left the marketplace. They don't have a job. They're not looking for a job. They're just outside the labor force, depending on their families for support or whatever. That's the last 5 years to show participation rate. Oh, here's the exam question. I voiced this on my sophomores. Minimum wage creates a balance between supply and demand in the market for unskilled labor. Okay? Facilitates the absorption of first-time job seekers into the labor force. I've had this as a test question. Here's my favorite. Guarantees a living wage to all able-bodied people who want to be a member of this country's labor force. You'd be surprised how many Auburn sophomores will go for that one. Yeah, that's it. That's because that's what they learned in high school, and they've cut all my classes, so they didn't get the other stuff. I hope this last one's right. Reduces job opportunities for unskilled workers. That's the dominant effect of the minimum wage. Telling question number 2. Can we get through 6 of them? I think so. Why did minimum wage specify a minimum total annual income for minimum wage workers in addition to the minimum hourly wage rate? If you want these people to have more money, you can't just specify the wage rate. But of course, that would violate the law of supply and demand. In other words, they can't pass legislation that is contrary to the law of supply and demand, short of outright socialization of labor markets. And so what happens is the total income going to unskilled labor may well go down. As you can see, that's how much income, that shaded area, that's how much income goes to unskilled labor if left to the marketplace. With minimum wage, you get fewer people working at those jobs, but each is getting a little more pay. The bad news is that demand curve becomes more inelastic as time goes by. Let me show it to you graphically, and then I'll give you an example. As time goes by, the demand for unskilled labor becomes more elastic as firms substitute capital or skilled labor for unskilled labor. So in other words, that demand curve has a lower slope now, and income to unskilled laborers goes down. All right, and this is a story many times, or told many times over. A good example is that episode in '68 where the minimum wage was raised to $10 effectively in today's dollars. That's the period in which service stations all over the country, more so in the South than in the North though, converted to self-serve. Some of you in here are old enough, I see a few, are old enough to remember that before that, there was no such thing as self-serve gas. You drive into a service station and you sit in your car, thank you, roll down your window and tell the attendant how much gas you want. And while it's filling your tank, he checks your oil, washes your windshield, checks your tires if you want. That's why it was called a service station, okay? You got service from these workers. But after that minimum wage, stations couldn't afford to pay $10 for that kind of employment. And so those people lost their jobs. And instead they installed the capital and where they could get readouts inside the station, and they had self-serve pumps, which eventually just overtook the whole business of selling gas. No service, just you provide your own service. Okay, so that's the elimination of a lot of jobs, and that's shown by that demand curve becoming more elastic as stations develop the self-serve capability. An increase in minimum wage will lead to a proportional increase in the total income received by unskilled workers? No. Increase the total income received by unskilled workers? No. Will actually decrease the total income received by unskilled workers if the demand for unskilled labor is elastic, and of course that C is the right answer. So it's doing bad things all along. Why doesn't the minimum wage apply to farm labor as well as to non-farm labor? That's a good question. In fact, that calls Gore's statement into question. Why shouldn't we honor hard work of farmers as well as hard work of others? Do they deserve no honor at all? What is this? Well, let's see it graphically. And here, the graph is the same as before, but I'll label it non-farm workers, because that's what it applies to, non-farm. And we'll put farm labor over here. What do you guess about the supply and demand for farm labor? Slopes upwards and demand slopes downwards, but the market clearing level is significantly lower. I'm making up the number, but significantly lower than in the case of farm workers. So what would happen if minimum wage did apply? Let's just extend it. Wow, you get a tremendous amount of unemployment. Politicians at some level understand that. We can't extend this legislation to farm workers. It would be a crisis, a disaster. Okay? And so they have a solution. Here it is. They don't extend it to farm workers. Sorry, farm workers have to be content with their market wage. But it's worse than that, because look, we've unemployed a bunch of people in the non-farm labor sector. Some of those people, not too many, but some of those people go to the farm sector where they can finally get a job. Well, of course, that increases the supply of farm labor, there it goes, and drives the wage rate down even further. So to some extent, people who gain by a minimum wage gain at the expense of farm workers who have a decrease in their wage rate when they were already making a very low wage rate. And once again, incomes can change, and it can change perversely. They may make collectively less than was earned before. Here it goes. Minimum wage makes supply and demand analysis irrelevant to the question of work and pay. Well, no, doesn't do that. Raises wage rates both on and off the farm. No, doesn't do that. Gives unskilled workers more flexibility by taking the question of pay off the table. Not so. Increases the supply of farm labor by restricting off-the-farm employment opportunities. That's the right answer, of course. Why do most all workers, skilled and unskilled, and especially labor unions, support raising the minimum wage? Union members already earn a lot more than the minimum wage, don't they? Is it just the altruism? They just really care for these people who don't make so much? No, you'd be surprised if that was the answer. Now our diagram is, again, unskilled labor, which it applies to. And on the left there, we'll put skilled labor, much of which is unionized. And what do you know about that supply and demand? They slope upward and downward, but at a higher wage. And I've called it $10 higher than that, but I'd run out of screen if I made it too much higher. So here, if you extend the minimum wage to them, well, it doesn't have a direct effect because it's already below what they're making. All right? So why do the skilled workers, union workers, support the minimum wage? Well, they're trying to price their competition out of business. In other words, they want it to be more expensive to hire unskilled workers so that you're more likely to hire skilled workers. And if it costs $7.25 to hire an unskilled worker, maybe you'll just go ahead and hire a skilled one. So the demand for skilled laborers will increase. Okay? And so skilled laborers, they gain in a double-barrel sort of way. There's more of them working, and they each get more money. So their income it unambiguously increases from where it was before to where it is now. Let me give you an example of this. There are lots of things that can be done, either with a few skilled workers or a lot of unskilled workers. And an example is a firm wants a fence put around its perimeter for security reasons. All right? How do you do it? Well, you could hire quite a few unskilled workers with post hole diggers. Did you ever use one? Kills your back. I've done it just once to put in a mailbox. You know, fence would be too long. But unskilled workers with post hole diggers, you can put in that fence, and you can figure out what's going to cost you to do that at $7.25 an hour per unskilled worker. Or you could hire a man on a machine. There's a big machine that's called a fence putter inner, I think. I'm not sure what it's called. But auger. Is that right? My son, when he was young, used to have videos of these gigantic machines doing things like that. And you can put it in a fence about as fast as you can drive, you know. You drive around the perimeter, clunk, 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 you got your fence in. But the guy that's driving it is a skilled operator. And so he's pretty expensive, and then you got to pay for the machine. All right? Well, which do you want? Unskilled or skilled? If unskilled sold for a market wage, maybe that's what you'd do. But if the government has rigged the wage above that, that could easily tip the scales in favor of hiring the fence putter inner. All right? And so that shows you the increased demand for skilled labor. So, and there's one other instance where the employment statistics don't show how perverse the minimum wage is, because the employment statistics would include the increased employment of skilled labor. All right? Here's Mises again. What the unions can cause by forcing employers to accept wage rates higher than the potential market rates is not inflation, he says, but unemployment on the part of the people anxious to get a job. Increases in the minimum wage are accompanied by unambiguous gains for both skilled and unskilled workers. No, unambiguous gains for skilled labor with mixed consequences for unskilled labor. I think that's the right answer. Two more telling questions. This one's an interesting one. Why is there no allowance for regional differences in the cost of living? We all know that the cost of living in the northern states is higher than the southern states. Among economists, north and south sometimes mean that literally, and sometimes it just means wealthy states, which would include California, even Southern California, opposed to poor states, which would be Mississippi and Alabama and several others, okay? Wouldn't a regional minimum create a more level playing field? Okay? Why shouldn't minimum wage be keyed to the cost of living in the area? And so here we have southern labor and northern labor, all right? Almost the same story, but with a twist. Northern labor is more expensive. You have to pay people more to work because the cost of living is so great. And once again, if you extend the minimum wage, really doesn't affect people directly over there. But for the same reason as before, it increases the demand for labor in the north. In fact, this is exactly why you don't have the cost of living difference, that the politics are dominated by northern politicians who want to give the northerners a competitive edge over the south. In other words, the single minimum wage imposes cost on producing in the south and gives a competitive edge to producers in the north. And that's what it's all about. Okay, that's where the political drive is, to increase the minimum wage. Now, the only difference here, see, when I had skilled and unskilled, you couldn't take an unskilled worker and have him say, oh, okay, I'm tired of this unskilled stuff. I'm going to go in the skill market and I'll do a lot better. Well, it takes quite a bit of trouble to get the skills you need. But you can go from south to north without too much trouble, a bus ticket, okay? And in fact, this is what explains in 1968 sort of a mass migration of low-income workers out of the south and into the north. Because up there, the minimum wage wasn't nearly as prohibitive and most people could get jobs up there. So as a result, some of the supply in the south leaves and goes north. Let's see if we can show that. Okay. So you can see the supply leaving in the south and then going north, but the net effect is still a higher wage rate in the north. And again, the north gains doubly in getting more work, in each worker getting more pay, and there's where the votes are to get the minimum wage. Now one more, let's say, an exam question. Increase in the federal minimum wage are typically supported by northern politicians who want to help eradicate poverty on a nationwide basis. No. Creates poverty in the south. Southern politicians who are interested in leveling the purchasing power playing field. No, it doesn't do that. Northern politicians who want to give northern manufacturers a competitive edge. And that's it, of course. Southern politicians who are most interested in eradicating rural poverty. No, it doesn't apply to the farm anyhow. Okay. This one I think is the best question. Save the best for last. Okay. Law specifies the minimum wage in nominal terms. Thus, the real value of the hour's worth of labor declines during periods of inflation. There's no built-in cost of living adjustment, COLA, C-O-L-A, cost of living adjustment. There is none for the minimum wage, okay, to compensate for inflation. And this goes back to the early part where I showed that minimum wage increases with legislation and then decreases as inflation erodes its purchasing power. All right? So telling question number 6, why don't the legislated increases in the minimum wage provide for automatic cost of living adjustments so that the minimum is specified in real terms and isn't eroded by inflation? How many think you know the answer to that question? First, let's see if just how much it's eroded or what the claims are. In the 8 years since Congress mandated the last increase, inflation has wiped out any gains. Current minimum wage is lower in value than at any time since 1949, since Harry Truman was president. So is he right about that? Well, Harry Truman was president in 49. Okay? But actually, there he is, okay? But actually, if you look at the minimum wage, I need to extend my graph just a little bit. There. To get it up to 2,000, that's when, minimum wage there. That's 2004. And there's 49. So he's right. He's right. It's been eroded, so it's not any higher than it was in 49. Okay? Now, think of it this way. If the minimum wage increased automatically with inflation, if you had a COLA, then it would cease to be a political issue. So here's the answer to the question, why don't you have a COLA? What? If the minimum wage were increased automatically, it would cease to become a political issue? We can't have that, okay? We need that as our political issue. We need it as a political issue. You can't take credit when you campaign for re-election to some COLA that some Congress of 20 or 30 years ago passed. How do you get credit for that? You have to get credit for what you passed, okay? Picture's worth 1,000 words. I mean, here's Bill Clinton signing into law the minimum wage. Another increase, that was the one in 2007, supposedly. No, one before that. And how many of those people surrounding him would ever forget that experience? They're only going to vote for increases in the minimum wage. Here's my sample question. And in fact, this is a particularly interesting question because I want to challenge the audience to think of even a plausible answer apart from the correct answer that I present. Because I had trouble thinking of implausible or plausible but wrong answers. All right? So, what plausible reason can explain? Supporters of the minimum wage didn't know that inflation might be a problem. I don't think so. Legislators didn't know that cost of living adjustments were an option. It's in a lot of other legislation. Drafters of the legislation simply forgot to include the cost of living adjustment. Is that it? Politicians don't want to lose the minimum wage as an issue in future election years. That's the reason, okay? And again, I challenge you to think of some other plausible reason why they wouldn't have cost of living adjustments. Even the states, there are state minimums as well. And typically, lots of states will put minimum wage increase on the ballot in a presidential election just as a draw. It's a hot button issue. It'll get out a bunch of people to vote for increase in the minimum wage. And if those are the people who are also likely to vote for the candidate you prefer, all the much the better. Lots of states did that in the last couple of elections. So anyhow, the next time you see a picture like this, I want you to think of it a little differently than you otherwise might. Here's my favorite, Lou Dobbs. And he says, he's got the question. He's got the right question. The question is, can Congress put politics aside long enough to raise the minimum wage? How many ways is that a wrong question? Look at the presuppositions of that question. What are the premises that underlie Dobbs' question? That the minimum wage should be raised, and everybody knows it. that the consequences are as advertised by its proponents, that political opposition can only stem from narrow private interests, that principal opposition reflects a slavish adherence to ideology, that market-determined wage rates are indefensible, that basic supply and demand analysis has no bearing on the issue. Okay? All of those are implied by his remarks. So raise the minimum wage? No. Okay. There prevails on the free market a tendency towards full employment. In fact, the policy of letting the free market determine the height of wage rates is the only reasonable, successful full employment policy. You have it from Mises. Thank you very much.